Can I get a level check? I can't hear myself. It, weird things happen if I try to do that, so I don't know if my voice is coming through over this. Okay. So I'm gonna jump in. Usually we sort of like futz around for a few minutes while we wait for people to catch up, but that's because I'm gonna mute this for a second. I'm using a new computer and I'm trying to force myself to use it, so I decided why not do a live stream where a lot of stuff depends on things going right, which in retrospect maybe not the best approach, but I learned a lot about switching from the Windows environment to the Mac environment, and I learned a lot about security permissions. So there's that. Um, so, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. Um, the idea here is to sort of jump into the patches. I might as well queue up the one we're going to start with, which is Trip the Light. That was requested by Make More Music podcast, I think. But I did just want to talk a little bit about how this generative series began for me, which was, um, I talked a little bit about this in the live stream that we had on generative patching a few weeks ago. And by the way, if you haven't seen that and you're interested in this topic, me and Mike and Mitch talked about all sorts of things that I think are probably pretty useful if you're getting started in generative patching, both in terms of like technique and artistry and some of the different ideas you might want to play around with. But, part of the reason that I did this is because I did not feel particularly comfortable with generative patching. Empress hired me to create some of the factory patches for the Euro Bureau. And, the ZOIA factory patches have a fair number of generative things contributed by Ben Jordan mostly, but some other excellent ones. I think Fire Ghosting did one, and a few other people. And it was something where I'm like, these are things we should have because they're, what has been there in the past. And I think it's one of the strengths of ZOIA. It's just not something that I felt particularly comfortable with. So anyhow, fast forward a few months after the release, I kind of decided to force myself to learn this stuff. Like I knew some concepts, but I hadn't really created a lot of generative stuff that I thought captured the sort of vibe or atmosphere or whatever that I wanted. And so, I've been doing these generative live streams now for about 4 months. And in some ways, I think I've progressed a lot, but, it's still a work in progress, right? Like it's still, a lot of this begins, and one of the things that people asked me about was to talk about the process, right? A lot of this begins with like failed patches. One of these Saturdays, I'm going to burn off a bunch of bad patches that I've written for live streams that I've abandoned because they just, they weren't musical or they were tedious or, they sounded bad, right? And I have a bunch of those. What makes it into the live stream is often like a first take that I find finesse, but there are patches that I'll put a few hours into and I'm like, this sounds bad, you know. And the thing about any of those patches is I hear them for a few hours before they make it to that Saturday live stream. So if I don't like them, uh, it's because I've heard them plenty enough. But anyhow, I'm sort of rambling. But that is part of the process. Sometimes patches don't make it to they end up on the cutting floor. Um, but these ones did not. So again, the purpose of this live stream is to go through some of the construction of these patches, but also some of the decision making that I made. This was something that some of my patrons on Patreon requested, and that's the last time I'm gonna mention Patreon because I look, I absolutely appreciate all the people who support me on Patreon, but I also think, you end up watching those things where they're like blah 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 Patreon. Well, I guess I've mentioned it a few more times, but this is the last. But they gave me some feedback on some things they were looking for, and that was one of them. Just sort of some insight into the process. So the first insight is that not everything makes it through the process, and I think with ZOIA, the best scenarios, the best outcomes come from people who are patient. You're gonna waste some time, but generally, if you're paying attention to what's happening, you learn something. Like those bad patches, I don't make bad patch after bad patch after bad patch. I go, well, that one wasn't very dynamic, and I didn't like the voices that I used, so let's try something different. Let's try some more modulation. Anyhow, so Trip the Light, most of the patches that I do, I'm going to start playing some audio, and let me know if my levels get screwy. But Trip the Light, most of these patches sort of begin and are structured the way that I built them. It's pretty rare that I'll go back and sort of move things around. I have an idea, and then I sort of build off of it. So there are 3 voices that are playing, and what I'm going to do is just mute them. There's a mixer on the first page, so that we can just hear them one by one. So there's this voice that goes through, and it's got a real hard pan back and forth, and it sort of has a little bit of an arpeggio feel. Got it. That's voice 1. And then voice 2 is not exactly like a lead line, but it's more meandering, right? It's sort of, some of the notes are longer than others, some are shorter. So I wanted something that's sort of a counterpoint to the pointillism of that first voice. And this also goes through some panning and into a delay. One of the things about Trip the Light in particular is that I wanted to have this challenge for myself. It's in the patch notes, it's in the description about, when I write these generative patches, and I'm sure I'm not the only person out there, I sort of lean heavy on the reverb, right, to provide that sense of space and lushness and that sort of thing. But that can be kind of a crutch, right? Like I think the other side of that is that stuff that's washed out in reverb kind of loses identity too. It sounds nice, but it all, to some degree or another, sounds nice in the same way. So this is not me saying I'm going to abandon reverb anytime soon, but it was kind of the impetus for this patch was to try to create a patch. There's lots of panning, lots of delay, lots of regeneration on the delay, so space gets filled out pretty sufficiently, but I wanted to avoid just going all in on reverb. So that's voice 2, it kind of meanders around. And then voice 3 is sort of this, it was supposed to be sort of a bass voice, but I kept losing it in the mix, so I brought the pitch up a little bit. But it's sort of like a lower, little bit of an arpeggio thing, a little bit of a meandering thing. And those are the 3 voices. So I'm going to go through them one by one, but before I do, I just want to talk about one thing that affects all of them, which is this last page called Random Fades. And I'll tell you, naming pages is difficult, to try to communicate what's going on. But they have, you'll see lots of flip-flops in this patch as you go around, and all of those are generally operating as clock dividers. So I could use clock dividers, but the benefit of flip-flops is twofold. One is that you don't really have to worry about like phase issues or anything like that, because a flip-flop will just, it'll go high when the incoming signal goes high. So they'll go back to an LFO that functions as like the major clock, and that is on this second page, just sort of zipping along. It's really fast because it gets clock divided down by these flip-flops. Here on this page we've got 3 more of them. So this flip-flop is outputting, each time it goes through a flip-flop, it gets divided by 2. So this last flip-flop is moving at 1/8 the speed of the original clock. And this may be what leads to the, those flip-flops are connected in a few places. But no, I don't know where you're coming in from. Where does this flip-flop get its... Well, maybe you just invented your own clock. Oh no, you come in here, which is another flip-flop that divides the clock even further. So anyhow, I'm getting lost in the minutia. And one of the things that I'm going to try to avoid to some degree is going over every single module. I'm failing at that right now. But the flip-flops are basically there just to create increments of time, right? Divisions of time. So this flip-flop is way slower than the clock for the patch. And it goes into yet another flip-flop to go even slower. And these go to random modules. And the random modules all go to their own comparator. And basically the comparators have really high positive inputs. So they rarely go low. But when they do, they pass through a slew limiter. And these slew limiters lead back to multipliers that inform the input of the various voices, right? So this multiplier has an envelope going on, right? And this is where the mixer value comes in. But it's also got this input for the slew limiter. And the idea there was that I think I might have added this during the live stream. The patch just got kind of busy and I wanted to thin it out. So sometimes, like a voice will just fade away for a little bit, right? It'll drop out for a little bit. So that's what's going on that page. And if you wanted to mess around with this patch and thin it out further, you could lower these positive comparator thresholds. And the slew limiters, I just sort of tuned by ear. So they're at 4 seconds, which is enough for them to fade, to really hear a fade and then a return to level. So, like I said, we've got 3 voices. This first voice, in some ways, is really simple. It's a sine wave that has an FM input, and that FM input comes from this, pardon me, too many crackers, the output of the sine wave itself, which feeds back into it. And that's controlled by this LFO here. One of the things I talked about in the generative live stream is you'll see lots of really slow LFOs. Since this voice moves a little bit faster, I have it, the LFO isn't just inching along, but it's still pretty slow. And the idea there is just so that when you hear this voice, there's some dynamic quality to it, right? It isn't just static as sine wave or square wave or whatever, right? That gets kind of dull after a while. So in a lot of my patches, I like to use FM synths because you can modulate the amount of FM and change the timbre as it goes along. Drop this down just a touch. And then that goes out to a VCA. I'm going to follow the audio path just for a second, and then I'll come back to some of the ways that the pitch is being determined, which is where one of those fades I was talking about happened. Caught it live. And you don't really, you notice them a little bit when all three voices are going, but it sort of just sounds like, the balance shifts a little bit, right? Anyhow. So this goes to a VCA. That VCA is controlled by this multiplier. As I said, one of the inputs of the multiplier comes from those fades on the last page. One of them leads right back to this mixer on the front page. And then the third one I'm going to come back to, but that's where the envelope comes in. It's actually two envelopes. That's why I'm going to come back to it. But the VCA skips over a couple pages and goes to a delay line. And the delay line is clocked by the clock of the entire patch, the really fast clock. So it's got a very short delay time, and the idea there is that notes can kind of stack on top of one another. So the delay line goes out to buffer delay. There's a reason for that. It gets summed with something. I forget why I put a buffer delay in there, but there's a good reason, probably. And occasionally that's gonna be the answer that I resort to. But this goes to a panner. So all the voices have a panner. The panner on this one is really like busy. It goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that leads to the output, right? So the last line is this delayed voice being sort of ping-ponged back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It has a feedback loop and some modulation. So there's an LFO modulating its delay time to add a little bit of a chorus. But there's also this feedback loop. And every so often, the feedback loop will change its gain structure. So it has an in switch down here that has different values. Right now it's on the highest value. When it's on the highest value, it doesn't quite feed back, but it starts getting really sort of dense with repeats in that zone. And it'll switch back and forth between those. This is another flip-flop that I think comes from one of these other flip-flops, a random module in the second voice, or the third voice. And that's another thing, right, to keep in mind is you can sort of use random elements from unrelated elements. Like you don't want to use the same random value to determine everything in a patch, or else the clock will speed up when the clock will speed up when the filter opens, when it'll not have that sort of air of like things evolving over time. There are occasions, like it might sound pretty cool if the clock sped up while the filter opened or whatever. So there are occasions where you might want to think about that, but I'll sort of cannibalize random elements from one part of a patch for another one. Particularly if I'm trying to save CPU. This one's pretty tight on the CPU stuff. But we'll see, William. I've got two, so I should have begun things. Trip the Light was requested, and then why am I blanking? I got a lot on my mind. What's the name of the other one that I'm doing? Daybreak was also requested. Daybreak should be pretty quick. Trip the Light's real weird and has a bunch of stuff going on. Thanks, Mike. And let me know if it, I can always sort of pause things for a little bit while I explain something too, if it gets hard to hear. Not a sponsor. So anyhow, the exact source isn't like super important. You can go through and sort of like play this game of finding out where it comes from. It comes from somewhere. You match up the lights, right? But the important thing is that every so often the feedback amount changes. And that, like also contributes to the sound of this voice. Because like I said, sometimes it gets like really dense with repeats and then alleviates, right? That's one of because this voice is really like busy, I wanted some way to sort of like build tension. And that was one of the ways that I went about it. We got another one of those fades. But like I said, they're not super common. When you're only listening to one voice, they seem really dramatic. Okay, so on to like the real weird shit. And I'm gonna skim over some of this because it just ends up being like a lot of stuff. But the important thing to keep in mind, the place that I'm going to go back to is that this patch is affected by two envelopes. And those two envelopes exist for different reasons. So we have one envelope. This is a longer envelope, and its clock is that 1/8 output that I talked about. It's turned into CV, and I did that so I wasn't quite sure how I wanted this envelope to sound. I knew I wanted it to be like tight with the clock, because a lot of this is really about being tight with the clock. Removing weird messages. Sorry. So a lot of this patch is about being like really tight with the clock and, a lot of like precise movements. Both of the ADSRs go to the VCA. So they control the amplitude, the level of this voice, right? And we can see them. I'm not sure how well this will come in. So one of them is operating at the clock speed. So it fires 8 times for every time this other ADSR fires. And we can see it here, right? It's sort of adding hairs to the underlying ADSR. So it flicks up. Anyhow, the reason for that is because there are two mechanisms that are controlling the pitch of this voice. One is a randomly generated tone that comes in somewhere. No. This is the quantizer for the patch. So we have, oh, this is another quantizer, right? So we have this random module that goes into a quantizer. I don't know why I used 2 quantizers. I think I was just sort of overthinking things. Probably only needs 1 quantizer, but one of them uses major pentatonic and one of them uses major, so they're doing slightly different things. So this is a random module that sort of sets the baseline for the patch. So every time, if we look at it, its clock is also tied to that 8th note, or that 8th division. So every time the underlying envelope fires, this random module selects a new sort of like baseline. But there's also this mixer that's feeding into the quantizer, and it has 2 sources. One of them is that longer ADSR. So the idea here is that like every 8 beats, you hear sort of like a rising tone. It's sort of like an arpeggio, right? Because as the ADSR moves through the quantizer will spit out the notes in that chord, or in that key and scale. The other source is a random module that's clocked by this really fast baseline clock. They both go into the mixer, and the mixer's in averaging mode, so those 2 values get averaged, right? They basically both get divided by 50% and glued back together. And then they're connected to the input of this quantizer. And the effect is that you get a baseline note that sort of shifts around every 8 beats. But you also get this sort of rising tonality. And that was how I originally had it, just with the ADSR going into the quantizer. It got a little tiresome because I can take, here I can show what that sounds like. I'll just take the random module out. It's nice. You know, it's pleasant, but it lacks a sort of pizzazz, let's say. So this other random module is sort of complementing that by shifting things around ever so slightly. There's still that air of like things rising, but it evens out. Okay. And then this really fast ADSR is clocked by that really fast clock, and it goes to the VCA, so that each time those new random values come in, they kind of get like a little accent, right? You know, if I remove this envelope, and the multiplier here is just sort of making it exponential, so it has more of that slope decay, right? It's still the same sort of sound, but it doesn't have quite that emphasis. Okay. So that's voice 1. And it's the most complicated voice. So hopefully the rest of these move a little bit faster. And I may need to take a break here. There's a lot of talking. been making a lot of videos that just have like voiceover. Sometimes Mike's here to, you know, let me off the hook, or Mitch or someone solo. So Voice 2 uses a slightly different synthesis method. Voice 1 doesn't have any filters at all. This one has 2 triangle wave oscillators that have duty cycle modulation. This is one of the tones that I come back to again and again, because that duty cycle modulation, especially with the sine and the triangle wave, what it does is it sort of adds harmonic content as you move to the extremes of the pulse width. You know, so it acts a little bit like a wave folder or something like that. And again, you know, with these patches, I want something that is sort of like changing over time, that's dynamic. So this is a pretty subdued voice in general. Part of that is because of the way that the filter is used, to sort of like bring down some of the high harmonic content. If you look at the filter, it's just sort of controlled mostly by the same pitch as one of the oscillators. I forget if it's got a little bit of an LFO action going on, so it gets a little bit brighter and a little bit quieter over time. But this is a pretty like chilled out voice. That was sort of the goal. The first voice is spastic and all over the place, and I wanted a counterpoint that was like a little more like just hanging out, drifting along, doing our thing. So this voice is like pretty simple. The beyond that, you know, like the biggest thing that it does that's kind of weird is that it selects. So it selects the length of its envelope each time the envelope cycles. So this envelope, this ADSR, leads into a comparator, and the comparator, when the envelope goes low, the comparator goes high, and it triggers a new random value, and that random value selects from these different inputs on an in switch. And these are all based on that tap to CV module in the first voice. So they're all sort of like variations on that. And they lead into these multipliers, and the multipliers determine the, you know, attack and decay and that sort of thing for that cycle of the voice. And it cycles back and through them. The other thing that this voice does that's a little bit wonky is, you know, like normally when I have 2 oscillators, I'll try to have them like change pitch at the same time, because generally that sounds good. Sometimes it's kind of abrasive when one of them like shifts around. This patch, I didn't do that. This voice goes through its own quantizer that's connected to the output of the first voice's quantizer. And the reason that it does that is because I've got this switch that again is controlled by some clock dividers and that sort of thing. But it's not tied. What I originally did was I tied it to that comparator so that it would only change when the ADSR was low. And this is already like a kind of subdued, spacey voice, and it just made things like even less interesting. This is kind of a palate cleanser. It's supposed to be less interesting, but you can still do some fun stuff. So basically this switch has a bunch of different intervals. So a fifth, an octave, a fifth and an octave, and a fifth below the current point. And those are added to the pitch of that first oscillator. So it always sort of shifts around in those like fixed interval relationships, but it does it at like times that are unrelated to that ADSR opening and closing. They're not totally unrelated because everything uses these. I assume I've got a random module, but I assume it goes back to another flip-flop. Oh no, it is connected to the comparator. Maybe I was lying. Maybe that was an interesting thing that you should try with this patch. I thought that was the case. This might have another input somewhere else. It's maybe what I'm thinking about, but it doesn't seem to. I think I'm just making stuff up that happens. I didn't double check that this morning when I was going through these patches. Sorry. It's a cool idea. It's what I should have done. But anyhow, this interval between the two voices changes. And the length of the envelope changes each time the envelope cycles. That's sort of like the big element of this patch. So they go through a filter and a VCA. That stuff's all pretty like standard. And then again, they go to a panner, and the panner is controlled by two LFOs that are joined at this multiplier. We can look at the output of that because one of them is faster than the other one, and it means that it'll sort of like it'll like move backwards through the panning every so often. Or give that like sense of like just sort of sliding backwards a little bit before moving on. This is panned, and then it goes into a regular delay with modulation. I think I was tired of building my own delay lines when I made this voice, so I just sort of said, fine. It's already got all the stuff built in that I wanted, mixing and modulation, all that jazz. So the third voice, let's bring this first voice back down. You can hear the third voice. The third voice is another FM modulated sine wave. But it's fixed. So it doesn't modulate the amount of feedback that it uses. It just feeds back into itself. I did that to give it a little more harmonic content, a little more heft. This is, again, something if you've got like a sine wave and you want to kind of keep that tonality, but add a bit more body to it, right? Like sine waves in their ideal form don't have any like high harmonic content. And this is another way to like keep it kind of sine wavy, but add some harmonic content. So the big thing about this one is that it's got an LFO feeding into its where is this? It's got an ADSR doing its thing. But if we find its quantizer, it's got this random output that selects different notes. Then it's also got a LFO that feeds into it, which gives that sort of like a note will be selected and then it'll sort of like drift up and through some other notes, like kind of a lazy ARP sound. That comes from this LFO that's on the other page, or no, from the ADSR. Oh, right. The ADSR is what's fed through the quantizer, and it's working sort of the same way as that ADSR with the first voice, where the ADSR with the first voice only has an attack and hold stage, so it rises and then holds at a like higher tone. This one has attack and decay. It's, it basically functions like a triangle LFO if we look at its output. I could have just subbed a triangle LFO here. You start working with an ADSR, you think you're going to keep working with the ADSR. So the big thing here is that the depth that ADSR is fed into the quantizer is modulated by, no, there's an LFO somewhere on this page. This one. Yes, probably. It seems wrong. Does this go to the filter eventually? Where's the one that goes to the filter? Yeah, this LFO that goes to the filter. It's connected to the filter's cutoff. And it modulates the amount that ADSR is fed into the quantizer. It's a pretty slow LFO. So sometimes the ADSR will cycle through more notes, right? Since it has a greater depth, right? Since it rises higher, when it passes through the quantizer, it'll hit more notes. So sometimes it'll hit like 5 notes, and sometimes it'll hit 1 or 2 as it cycles. And so you get this ARP that like moves along. Because that LFO is tied to the filter, it's also when the sound gets brighter. So, you know, the idea is when it gets brighter, you hear a busier ARP sound. And then, you know, there's a couple of other things going on with the VCA modulation, just because I wanted to have it without the fade part, just be quiet sometimes. It's kind of an annoying sound all on its own. I don't know if you agree with me on that one. Like, this is one of the ones, I'm going to turn it up a little bit. I don't love this sound. I think it works well with the other voices. So, you know, once again, we've got a situation where the output goes to delay, right? Delay, and the output are summed at an audio panner. So, and then those go to the outputs. And again, they have, you know, some weird modulation stuff going on. If I remember correctly, this one has a triangle LFO, but every time it passes through 0, it picks a new random value. So that modulates the yeah, we're seeing that. That modulates the width of the panning. Each time the pan passes through 0, and 0 is like the center point of the left and right. So again, the whole idea with this patch really is sort of like twofold. Is one, you know, like to use different modulation sources to affect the quantizers to create like quasi-arpeggiated sounds. And then the other is just like a lot of modulation on panning, I think really helps make the stereo space pretty big from just 3 voices. So I know I went through like some of that stuff pretty fast, but I think if you went back and looked at this patch after listening to that and you know, you could suss out some of the other stuff going on. You know, if I just dive into like every module, it gets tricky. So again, this is really like, I think, and a patch, a lot of my patches will have like 3 or 4 voices that are all pretty similar, and like they get their intensity from volume, right? Like you just slam a bunch of like really deep droning sawtoons at you or whatever, you know, FM voices, like that sounds pretty cool. This one is one that took a lot more finesse to try and get these voices that, like, I think all of them on their own are kind of annoying, if I'm being honest with you. I think the sum is greater than the parts, and that's like a tricky thing to do. It's really easy to take, like, I'm just gonna have a bunch of sine waves. Sine waves kind of sound good. I'm gonna make them a little distorted. Adding distortion to sine waves sounds good. Then a bunch of reverb. and I'm not. I've made that patch, so I'm not dismissing that approach. But like this patch took for me, I think, a lot more time to think about how things like worked in a mix, which I don't necessarily pay as much attention to when it's like four of the same thing and then a fifth thing that's slightly different. So, you know, like that's the nice thing here. And I think, again, like the voices stand out as a sum of their parts more than they do as individual voices. So that's Trip the Light. I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions about Trip the Light or whatever before I move on to the next one, because I could use like the next one is Daybreak for people playing along at home. But I'm going to mute that for a second. I'm going to drink some Coke Zero. I'm going to see if there's anyone who, you know, who has questions or whatever while I take a moment. A lot of talking. I again, Brandon, I was calling myself out too. I assure you. I think you know it's like I said, I think it's really well. I feel like Rob's sending me a softball here because the next patch involves sequencers. Um, and so, like, you know, I think this, as I said in the live stream, we discussed this some in the live stream. Like, I think in almost all cases, purity tests are bad, right? Like, I guess some of them are pretty good. Like, I don't want you to be like a little bit fascist. Although, if you read your Deleuze, he makes a compelling argument that we're all a little bit fascist, and that's. But you know, if you, and I should point out there's some delay here. I haven't figured out exactly how long it is. So if it seems like you wrote something a while ago and I'm responding to it now, that's what's going on there. But you know, like for most things, I think purity tests are bad ideas. So particularly in the realm of aesthetics, you know, I mean, I think people get really sort of obsessed with. You know, when I was a kid, I came up through like punk bands, and like punk bands the punk scene can have like a lot of like real purity tests, right? Like, oh, you know, like they're too corporate, blah, 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 blah. They're too pop, right? Like this was the early 90s. So there was that, you know, you had Blink 182 on one end sort of being, and then there were, you know, people were like, you know, punk died when Minor Threat broke up or whatever. Who cares? Anyhow, I think sequencers have a place in music that you would think of as generative. If someone wants to say true generative music doesn't involve sequencing, it's fine. We're not here to, you know, I think I'm not here to like be some sort of like authentic generative proponent or whatever. That's someone else's gig. So yeah, so I see. I'll talk a little bit about Brandon's question here. So what happens is that the Brandon asks, I don't have the StreamYard thing, so I can't like pull the chat things onto the screen. It's a really nice thing, but I didn't want to mess around with the authorization keys for that. I think I get better quality and better sound out of OBS, which is what I'm using. But when you're dealing with like multiple participants, it's way easier to use StreamYard, and StreamYard has that cool little thing. So Brandon asked, can you explain the new random value when it passes through zero thing? So this is going back to the third voice in Triptylite, and the way that its panning is modulated. So what I have is as -1 to 1 LFO. I'm pretty sure it's a triangle LFO, but it doesn't really matter. I have a -1 to 1 LFO, and it's passed through the positive input of a comparator, or you could pass it through the negative input of a comparator. It's going to basically function the same way, and nothing else is done with the comparator. So what happens is every time the LFO rises above 1, the comparator goes, or rises above 0, the comparator goes high. And that triggers a random value. And then the LFO and the random value are multiplied together. So the random value will determine the depth of the LFO each time, and that depth will change each time it comes back through 0. Bing, we've got a new depth, and that depth might be smaller this time. Go back through 0 and come back up, and then boom, we get a new depth, and this time it might be more extreme, right? So, basically I'm using a comparator there just to sort of like figure out when that happens, and use that as a trigger for the random value. I hope that explains it. But yeah, I think one of the things to think about with modulation, I do like combining random values with modulation sources. In some of my patches, like I'll have the ADSR trigger. When the ADSR is triggered, it'll also trigger a random value, and the purpose of that is to sort of provide it's like a velocity control, like a variable velocity. And usually what I'll do is combine those through a multiplier, and I'll have the random value not just determine the whole thing, because then you get like a lot of variation. And that sounds funky. It can sound good, right? I'm not trying to set down any maxims here, but like if I'll have the ADSR go into one input of the multiplier, and then the other input I'll bias to like 0.5 and connect that random value at a 50% connection strength, so that it's just going between 0.5 and 1. Yeah. So that's, like I said, I like that element of combining random elements with like other modulation sources, because it can add, again, that element of like changes that are the same, right? Like it's still an ADSR, it's still an LFO that's modulating the pan, right? It's still that thing, but the intensity to which it does that is changing. So that's a sort of like general approach that I take to a lot of things. And you'll see in my patches, there are a lot of places where like 2 LFOs or 3 even will affect the same parameter, or might be joined in a multiplier or something like that, so that they're all influencing one another. And that's, like you get that same but different thing, which I think is like the heart of generative music. You can have generative music that just like, I could connect a random module to like every parameter in a patch and press a push button, and it would do like crazy stuff. And that, if that's what you're into, like I can definitely see the appeal of that chaotic approach. But if you take a more tempered approach, like I do with a lot of my stuff, being able to combine more traditional modulation sources with the randomness, I think, adds a nice element of same but different, right? Like something that feels as though it has a human touch. And so I'm gonna let this patch play, Daybreak, as just like a reminder, but also because I want to like stand up and stretch and drink something. So I'll probably be back in like 3 or 4 minutes. I'm not going to take like a super long break, but I want to. This whole idea of answering questions still has me talking. But then we'll jump back into Daybreak when I get back. Okay. Let's get situated. Let's get the creaks out of the chair. Always more creaks in the chair. I don't know Riley's in C, but I'll assume that's a good thing. Okay, well, before I get started, that's a good question, right? I'm gonna use this patch to answer it, I think. We're gonna skip to the end. This patch, Daybreak, has 3 voices that all kind of do the same thing. They either have drones or they go through these sort of sequence stretches that we're hearing, hopefully. I don't know, level check at some point. But there's a 4th voice in this patch, which is a FM voice. So, in this particular example, they don't quite influence the same thing, but they do operate in a way that influences the sound. Do I have a good way to isolate this voice? No, but I can probably make it louder. Let's try that. So I just made the FM voice louder, and it has this more dissonant, harsher tone that we're hearing now. And the FM voice in this patch, I'm going to turn it back down just a little bit, but I might turn it up again. The FM voice in this patch is composed of, when you're doing FM, they use different words, which is one of the joys of FM. They call oscillators operators, and part of that is because oscillators in an FM tone can do one of two things. They can operate in different ways, but it's still some, I think, unnecessarily confusing language. Basically, what FM is, and I'm going to say basically because it gets way more complex than this, is an audio rate vibrato. So one oscillator modulates the frequency, the pitch of another oscillator at audio rates, and in doing so creates a lot of harmonic content. You usually start with pretty harmonically poor waves like sine waves. This patch uses sine waves for FM, but you can use all sorts of waves for FM. Now, here we have what is called a carrier. And the carrier is the oscillator that you hear. This is the only one that goes out into the world. The other two oscillators are modulators, so they're modulating frequency. And they, in fact, have this sort of tiered system. Each of them passes through a VCA. And I'm doing a bullet point thing on FM here because I didn't really plan on talking about like the whole what FM is. There are better resources than what I'm going to give here, but the amount that each of the oscillators modulate one another is controlled by these VCAs. There are two VCAs. So we've got one oscillator, it goes into a VCA. It goes into this other oscillator, and this oscillator we don't hear. It's not a carrier. It goes into another VCA, and we hear it modulate this third oscillator, which we do hear. That's the carrier. And these are set at different intervals. One is set at a fifth above, and one should be set at a fifth and 6 semitones. It's supposed to be a dissonant thing, but I discovered when I was going over this patch earlier that I hadn't made this connection, which adds a lot of dissonance to the sound if I increase it again. But I hadn't done that, so it was just operating at the same frequency as the other voices. Sorry, getting rid of some spam. We can change that around and get different dissonant tones. But anyhow, my point is that the amount that each of those oscillators is influencing the next one in the line is controlled by like really slow LFOs. And the output of this voice is controlled by another slow LFO. And so what happens is that because all of those things are modulating at different speeds, they'll have additive elements where they like reinforce what's happening, right? Like a lot of FM sound happening at once, or a little bit. So that's one way. The other one is just to use like something that I do a lot. Something that I do a lot is I'll have like an LFO maybe connected to, you'll see this in a second when I get to the other part of the patch. I'll have an LFO that goes from -1 to 1, so it drops through 0, connected to like the filter of a voice. And another one where there's another LFO that only moves from 0 to 1, but it might be attenuated somewhat. So basically the idea is if this is like the baseline filter frequency, when we drop below this, we're in sub-audio territory. If I combine two LFOs at that filter frequency, like I can have it drop into sub-audio territories, and then rise into audio territories, but still have like modulation in that audio territory and swinging back through. So these things can be added together to have like a cumulative effects or effects that make something stronger at certain times and less pronounced at other times. So anyhow, there are a lot of ways that, and you can use, well, there are a lot of ways that you can use more than one LFO or more than one modulation source on the same destination creatively to introduce this idea again of like change and difference over time. So this is the FM voice, and basically whenever it drops to 0, actually not always when it drops to 0. What happens here is that this LFO that controls the output of the FM voice is connected to the negative input of the comparator, and that negative input of the comparator is at 0. But that's such a precise coincidence that the sampling window of ZOIA doesn't always fall at that point where both of them are 0, where the LFO's output is 0 to match the positive input of the comparator. So every now and then, this comparator goes high. And so you get a few notes that hold at one pitch and then it'll change, which I kind of like. It wasn't really what I intended, but embrace happy accidents. So this sample and hold goes to all of the oscillators. But it draws its input from, I chose one of the voices at random, the second voice, its output. And it just sort of, every time it goes, that LFO goes low, there's a chance that things will, go through, and it'll change, notes. Otherwise, so there's the FM voice, and then there are 3 voices in this patch that are the same, more or less. There's some very subtle differences, but they all use the same type of oscillator, which I believe is a square wave. Yeah, so this is a square wave. It's got pulse width modulation going on, so again, there's some difference between the voices. And then what happens is there is an LFO, one of these LFOs that goes through 0. When it drops below 0, if if we look at its output, it goes to a comparator. And that comparator is biased by another value module. I'm not sure if there's some glare here. To -8. It doesn't really matter. The point is that just, what happens is the comparator will go high when this filter is at a sub-audio frequency. And sorry, again, removing spam. So each of these voices has a different speed of LFO controlling the filter. So that they all operate kind of independently. But when this comparator goes high, a couple of things happen. One, a random module that feeds into the quantizer for that voice is selected. So again, we have a situation kind of like in that first patch where there's like a baseline that's selected at a slower period than other stuff. This comparator will do that. It'll also go to another random module, and that random module controls an in switch, and connected to the output of that in switch are an LFO, a clock divider, or a flip-flop operating as a clock divider again, and another one. So we have essentially 3 time signatures, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 4. And it selects between those and then sends the output of that to a sequencer. Each voice has its own sequencer. The sequences are mostly the same. I didn't have time to get real creative with the differences between them. There are some minor differences. And then there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different sequencer tracks. Those go into another in switch. And this is fed back to the quantizer so that those sequences, whatever they are, they'll be quantized to stay in the right key. So that may change some of the relationships between intervals slightly, depending on which sequence is selected. And that was, also to give just a little bit more variety to the sound beyond maintaining, everything in a key of C major, which is nice, but it's a sort of a quick way to, because you'll have different root notes for that quantization. Sometimes you'll have a note or two in one of the sequences pushed into a new interval position. So these switches lead to the quantizer, which goes back to the oscillator, and we can kind of see this in action if we just, I want it to eyeball, not star. I don't know if you can see that, but there's sort of a stepped quality to the oscillator frequency that comes from that combination of the sequence and this baseline note. And then there's, for this oscillator, there's a 5th option that might be randomly selected each time that comparator is triggered, and that's just nothing at all. And all of the voices have that, so they can just drone. So sometimes they drone, sometimes they play a sequence, and the other 2 voices are slightly different from the first because they have a 6th position, which is just a random value. So they might play a prepared sequence, or they might drone, or these voices 2 and 3 might also select just random notes. And the random notes have more range than the sequence notes. So they're, they stand out a little bit more as these sort of impromptu moments of, I don't know if you can hear, one of the voices just did one of these, and it went, it stands out a little bit more because it has that range. It can reach higher notes. And so that was, like a big part of how I thought about how to introduce like a random element into the pitch without it, like this is really a patch that's really dominated more by repetitions. And so, there's a trade-off there, right? You can have sounds that are like really kind of repetitive, and when a random element breaks through, it sounds more pronounced. And you can have stuff that's really random, and when a more like ordered element comes through, it can also stand out. So I forget who, I get someone, William, if you're out there, like asked about Wanderlust. And Wanderlust, no. Wanderlust doesn't have this. I was thinking of Dreaming itself, which I did as a patch a couple weeks ago. Dreaming itself also has a sequenced element. And every now and then that sequenced element, like, brings cohesion back to something that is otherwise like pretty randomly generated. And so, you can think of these things like a sequencer patch or maybe just like even a rhythmic element that like repeats as a way of like, they'll stand out because they're so different from the sort of more generative elements, right? The more chaotic or unpredictable elements is to bring some like line of order back into the process. And one of the other things that I considered for this patch when I was making it is that, another way to achieve this is, one of these sequences only on the first channel, but and I'll explain why in a second. I could have a sequence where 4 or 5 of the 6 notes are sequenced, and the 6th note is randomly determined because I attached a random value to that step. You can only attach modules to the first track of a sequencer, which is the reason that I say this. And that's part of the reason that I didn't do that, because, I sort of thought, I can't do it on every track, but that's another option, right? When you're making a sequenced sort of like sound thing, if you're, is to add something that's pretty orderly, right? Like you've got a sequence that you like, but that like, I don't know, the 13th note and an otherwise sequenced, string of 16 notes or whatever, that one might shift around a little bit, right? Like it might be, an A one time around and then an E and then G or whatever. And that can add a real element of surprise to something that can otherwise be a little bit repetitive. So, yeah. So that's what's going on with Daybreak, right? Like 3 of the voices are doing that, and then there's this 3rd or 4th FM drone. And then this one, everything does go into, first of all, there's a multi-filter. I don't know if you noticed this, but this patch has no filter, or the FM voice has a VCA, but the arpeggiated sequence voices don't have VCAs. And this is another trick that I sometimes use to save CPU. I sometimes use it just because, That's how I'm thinking about it. I'll have an oscillator, and rather than having a filter and a VCA, you can just use a filter if the filter goes low enough, right? So filters as of firmware 1.13. It's been a while. We've had this for a while. I'm not sure, read the change logs. That's a tip for everyone. Go back and I would say go back if you're new to ZOIA, or if you haven't done this already, go back and read the change log for firmware all the way back to the beginning, because it sort of tells a history of ZOIA's development. But there's also stuff that a lot of the stuff that's in the change log has made its way into the module index and that sort of thing. But when you see it as a change, as something that was added, you start going, well, why was it added? So filters can play at sub-audio levels, or they can't play, and so you can use them to cut off audio entirely. If it only drops, you need to use negative CV to do this, because if it only drops to the lowest frequency that a filter reaches, at a value of 0, which is like 28 hertz, you'll hear like a really low sound. This is a long way of explaining. What I've added here is a high pass filter before the output. I put it at like 52 hertz, and I do this whenever I have like a bunch of voices that use filters as they're kind of working like low pass gates, because they act as both a filter and as an a VCA. They control the amplitude of the oscillator. Not, people usually think of low pass gates as sort of like plingy bongo sort of sounds, but it's the same general concept, right? A filter that controls both the harmonic content of an oscillator and its volume amplitude. But the multi-filter is just there to sort of like, there's a lot of mud that gets created when you do that, because even as it drops into like low audio realms, you're getting like rumbles at 30 hertz, 20 hertz, whatever, and those can add up and create distortion or just sound bad. So this multi-filter here is cleaning up some of that low-end mud that comes from like my decision in this patch not to use any VCAs. And then that goes into a delay with mod, and then into a reverb light. So pretty like standard spacey, dreamy stuff. And that is Daybreak. And to just sort of like talk about this patch, I don't know if there's like a real clear genesis moment. I kind of heard this patch that like moved between droning and more, some of the things I've been talking about, right? Like something a little bit more orderly. I had been making patches that all had kind of like a dour quality, and I wanted something like a little bit brighter and cheerier, right? So there's definitely some dour, somber FM drones and pulse width drones and that sort of thing going on, but out of that, like these sort of like flurries, right? These little brushes of something a little bit more whimsical, a little bit more cheerful, so, I'll just sort of like talk about that for a second, because again, people wanted me to sort of talk about the process. I'd say for me, the like genesis of a lot of these patches begins in like one of two ways. One is I either have like an intellectual idea that I want to try out. What if I have two shift registers that trade off, which oscillators they control. Like that might be an interesting sound. Um, or what if I have a clock that, does this, that, or whatever, right? But it begins as sort of like a technical challenge, right? Like, what does it sound like if I do this, right? It begins, I would say, more as like a question, an experiment. And sometimes those experiments pan out. Sometimes they definitely do not. But, like, so that's how some of the patches begin. And I'll get some like interesting mechanism that I want to complement with some voices or some other stuff going on or whatever. And then the other way that they begin is just sort of like I get like a sound in my head. And this one, like I had that sort of sound of like, I don't know, maybe like sunlight breaking through clouds or something like that, right? Like the drones or this bed of noise. And then you get these, beams that come through in the form of these little sequenced runs. And then they fade back into the clouds, right? Like it's not just all sequenced, trilly, happy stuff all the time. But like it's this sort of like interplay between, I wouldn't say light and dark, but maybe like heavy and light, right? And so that's sort of like just I heard something like that in my head. And I wanted to like, it didn't necessarily sound like this, but it sounded like something where there was this, that like trade-off between heavy and light. And that was sort of what gave me the impetus for this patch. So some of them be like, they have all sorts of different starting points. Like, what does it sound like if I do this is the way that a lot of them begin. And maybe that sounds cool. And then I apply something I've done before, or, but sometimes they begin with like, I've got an idea, and that idea is not necessarily like a musical one. I'm not someone who is synesthetic or like the people you meet all over the internet who claim they're synesthetic. But like there is this element, I think, for all of us who spend some time with music, right? Like that there are ideas or visions or whatever that you can associate with sound or associate with music. So like they'll begin as like visions, a lot of my like more inspired work comes from the natural world. And if you've been watching since I set up the leaf peeper cam that became the snow peeper cam that is mostly just making my backyard famous, like I spend a lot of time looking out that window, I spend a lot of time looking at trees. If you've seen my Instagram music videos I've made for trees, or maybe like sunsets and that sort of thing. So that's where, a lot of the conceptualization, I'd say, like has for me some sort of analog to a natural process. And that's the most I've ever spoken about the creative process, which is, so that's Daybreak. I'm gonna open it up for questions, and then I'll have a little bit of time to talk about Wanderlust as well. No. So Alexei had a question. I've done a lot of videos, I feel like, where I've created patches step by step. I have like a lot of tutorials that go through, sort of like the basics of something. I'd say, like, if you're asking about like creating one of these generative patches, like, that was something that was asked, like, could you do that from scratch? And I can, but the process is like not linear. I don't just like sit down. Like I said, there's different modes of inspiration. Um, there are different like there are different modes of inspiration. There are different times. Like a lot of the time that I patch these things is like chilling on the couch or whatever, and uh, it's not just I go, I am going to sit down today and I'm going to make this patch. Like most of the time when I do that, it goes pretty poorly. If you watch my video on generative patching in ZOIA, like I go through a lot of like interesting technical stuff in there, and I'm not trying to dismiss that aspect of that video, but the patch that I end up with at the end of that, because I'm like trying to patch from scratch and make stuff up as I go along and whatever, like it fucking blows. I mean, it's bad. If someone has found an appreciation for that patch, I sincerely apologize, but I don't consider it my best work on an aesthetic level, because like, I was just trying to sort of like get stuff done. And I feel like that's the tricky part of making a video about anything is, like I'm not like some people you're going to see making videos, they're doing it because they have a genuine affection for like, they kind of wish they'd gone to film school or whatever. I fucking hate making videos. I hate doing these live streams. I really do. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad, but like, my whole YouTube career began with me being on ZOIA forums and answering questions in the written form, which I considered the perfect way to answer them. And people just pushing me again and again and again, make a video about it. And I'm like, you can read this answer I gave you in 2 minutes and you can come back to it and read it again and again and again. Making a video takes a lot longer and generally is not a particularly efficient way to communicate information. And again, like I'm a pretty comfortable public speaker. I taught for a while. You put me in front of like a room full of 50 strangers and I can extemporaneize, but this thing where I'm like staring at a camera or talking to a camera feels very, very alien to me. So, like editing takes too long, all that, like I appreciate the people who watch my videos. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but like there are a lot of things I would rather do with my time than make videos. And so like, the idea of patching from scratch, like it takes something that's already like pretty tedious for me and makes it so much more complicated. So like, yeah, I'm willing to make compromises. I said, I hate doing this. I don't hate doing this. I'm not like unhappy to be here, but like, again, the more complicated you make that process, just like, I'm just some guy, like, you want to pay me real money, and I mean real money, to do some of the things that people ask me to do. And again, I'm not saying that's the outcome that I want, but like that's a different conversation. But people, yeah, like I'm not gonna do more than I'm doing now, I guess is the way to answer that. So yeah, uh, audiation. So that's a really long and audiation. You're gonna have to pronounce that for me sometime, Jombi. Uh, I'm sorry if that comes across as defensive, but like this is almost year 3 of people like asking me to do stuff, and I like doing stuff for the community, but like there's a limit, you know, um, and this is like like a hobby that takes up way too much of my time. So yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about Wanderlust. I hadn't really prepped this, so I don't have like a strategy. So I'm probably just going to talk about some stuff that like relate to things that we've already discussed. And I'm going to do that for not a super long time, probably like 10 or 15 minutes because we're getting close to the witching hour. So Wanderlust is one of those like patches that is, like I would think of as like that straw man that I set up for like how Trip the Light is different. Like Trip the Light, each of the voices are very individuated. And Wanderlust, everything's kind of the same. The variety that comes up is that there's sort of like it. I think of it as like, do you know Carvel ice cream? Is it Carvel? I don't have it in my area. No, it's Cold Stone. Cold Stone's the one where you go and you get like a base ice cream and then like, they mix in a bunch of crap and you're like, oh, candy plus whatever. But like, all of the voices are sort of like the ice cream. And then there's a couple of processes that go on that kind of sprinkle candy over a given voice at a given time, right? So these are all duty modulated sine waves, and I've, talked a bit about why I like those. Again, they're controlled by some LFOs on the second page. And one of the things about this patch that's maybe a little bit different that I haven't talked about is that there are LFOs that control the rate of LFOs. There's some of those in Trip the Light too, but they're a big part of this patch. So I've got individual LFOs that go to each of the oscillator's duty cycles, and then there's an LFO that's multiplied many times, and that is to change it. It's a triangle wave LFO at the beginning, so it would normally go smoothly up and down, but because it's been multiplied, it becomes sort of like a peak, right? Like it's asymptotic for a while and then it just quickly rises and drops. And I use that approach a fair amount when I'm modulating rate because it allows you to sort of have these like moments of rising flutter, whatever, modulation. The LFOs will all kind of like speed up in unison and then drop down pretty quickly. And so, it's a way to do that that I think just sounds a little bit more crescendo-y and, natural than just sort of like steadily ramping up. That's what a normal triangle wave would do. So this is more, curvy. So anyhow, and then they all go through VCAs, and the VCAs here are controlled by 3 different LFOs each. One is individual for that VCA, and then each of those individual VCA LFOs modulate the other individual LFOs just a little bit, right? Like it's just enough to add a little pizzazz to their step. But they're also modulated by this LFO, which goes from 0 to 1, and it's connected. All of these are connected at less than 100%. They're all connected. If I remember correctly, these are connected at about No, they're all connected at 33%. So they don't ever add up to more than one. But like there's this -1 to 1 LFO that can drop any of the voices into negative territory, and these are -1 to 1 LFOs as well. So there's, voices fading in and out. Sometimes there'll be like a gradual buildup of the likelihood that they're fading in and out because of this much slower LFO. Then there's a third LFO that controls the rate of these LFOs. And again, that's, like to give that sort of like ramping up thing. And we can see that like these LFOs will start, I think it's a pretty effect to look at, just like aesthetically. They'll start getting faster and faster and faster and faster. So there are no filters again in this patch, but the VCAs are being modulated in a lot of different ways to bring complexity to the sound. But that's pretty much it for like sound generation. The VCAs go into some delays. These are ping pong delays, so they bounce the signal back and forth, and they're panned, right? One is, and the panning is not done by a panning module, it's just done by connection strength. So one of the voices is connected 100% to one of the inputs, one of these delay line inputs, and one is connected 100% to the other one, and the other two are connected. One is 66% to this side and 33% to the other side, and one is the inverse. So they're spread out pretty evenly across the stereo field. But then they go into this ping pong delay, and the reason that I didn't use a ping pong delay module is because it doesn't have the same process of regeneration. And I wanted stuff to bounce off the walls back and forth. So I made my own, and it's clocked by, I don't remember, something. By the clock that drives, there's a shift register that moves voices through these oscillators. And sometimes it moves them forward and sometimes it moves them backward, which is a cool effect, but probably costs too much CPU for something that's not really noticeable. So sometimes a note will begin at this voice that's panned to the semi-middle, and it'll move this way, and then it'll move back and this way. Okay. Yeah, that's what I meant by a homebrew ping pong delay. So instead of using the module, and then in that case, the mixing is done by the output of the delay lines. So I have them slightly lower than the input connections to the reverb at the end, so that they're not as loud as the oscillators going into them. So there's a shift register. I've talked about shift registers a bit. I'm gonna do a video pretty soon on sample and hold modules, and I'm gonna, I think, try to really go into detail about shift registers. But basically, the shift register, as I've mentioned before, it takes values and it sort of moves them around between the voices, right? So each one of, it's only a 4-step shift register. So each one of the 4 steps goes out to a multiplier, and the multiplier is just there so we can attenuate the signal a little bit, get it in the range that we want, and then it goes to a quantizer. And this is where the candy comes in. Each voice has its own quantizer, And that means that we can do things that we wouldn't do. So I've talked about, you can quantize stuff as it goes into a shift register, or you can quantize stuff as it comes out of a shift register. And the two have different outcomes, right? Because one of the things about a shift register is that like everything's sort of locked in place until the next, clock signal comes along. So it's not real dynamic between those clock signals. It's not dynamic at all. And the outcome is sort of like locked in place. But because the quantization occurs on the output, which is more CPU intensive, but in this case pays off, basically all of these quantizers have another input, or another 3 inputs. There's an out switch. There are 3 out switches. One of them is fed by an ADSR. Which one is this? This is the LFOs. Yeah. So one of them is fed by LFOs, and there's some things that randomly determine which one of the quantizers it goes to, but the output of this out switch is connected to each one of those quantizers, and the LFO is connected via this multiplier to the input of the out switch. So basically every time the comparator in this page goes high, an LFO will be fed somewhere. And these LFOs are clocked by the fastest clock in the system. The clock register, or the shift register, is clocked, for instance, by a flip-flop that's 1/4 of that speed. So it's to give sort of trilly stuff. The other one is an ADSR, which will just sort of, it's a lot like how the ADSR functions in trip to light. It'll rise and then hold at a position. And that'll be fed into the quantizer, and because it's quantized, you'll hear it as a run of pitches that'll ascend. And the third one is a randomization that occurs on this page. And again, so all of those have the same sort of like general idea, which is that they only occur every so often. That's set up by a probability gate on each of the pages. And they go to different quantizers. The quantizers go to different oscillators. So you get these little things, like sometimes voice, if we think of them as A, B, C, D, voice A will have a little LFO trill. And voice C will have that envelope that is a little bit slower, and it rises and holds at a new note. And voice D will have just some random values, some random notes, because they're quantized. They're quantized to the key and scale, sort of like shuffle across. Yeah. And this one can sometimes go to more than one voice at once. But that's the candy that's sprinkled over top of like the base ice cream in Wanderlust. And the two things that I think really sort of make it stand out are that element, right? Like there are these little things that stand out, right? Little trills, little arpeggios, little impromptu melodies created by the random values. But the other one is that modulation of the rate of the modulation. So you get that sort of like rising sense of drama and release when it falls back. Sometimes that's just to speak to like the genesis of this patch. I Um, I tried that sort of approach before with another patch called Consonants, and there are a lot of similarities between Consonants and this patch. So I thought that'd be a good way to go about it. So, yeah. And I'll say I do see your question, John, but honestly, I'm not sure. If maybe that's not a better question for one of the written forums, because debugging is not exactly the topic being discussed here. Um, and I don't have debugging traceback connections. It's all, I think, pretty simple troubleshooting stuff that you just do. Some of it has to do with what's going wrong, and the more experience you have patching, the more you might say, oh, I've heard this sort of thing before, or experienced this sort of thing before, and gone back. But there's so many different debugging strategies depending on what sort of bug is being encountered, right? Is it the audio sounds off, or is it I thought this would happen to the modulation, but this other thing happened, or so maybe that's a question for our ZOIA or the ZOIA Discord to bite into. But yeah, I don't have I don't know how I debug stuff. I just sort of, one of the things is, something, if I make a connection and something goes wrong, probably has something to do with that connection. But beyond that, it's all, there's no key to debugging. It's all grunt work. So yeah, thank you, William, and I'm glad this was helpful. One thing that I will say is that I've been doing the live stream, I've been doing the live stream for 4 months now. I haven't missed a Saturday, and I have a patch pretty good for this Saturday, but one of these Saturdays coming up, I am going to take off. I'll try to give some advance warning in some way or another. But I just thought I'd say that it's been it wasn't a real planned out thought on my part when I started doing the Saturday morning live streams. I was like, oh, this is kind of fun. And I think I just need sometime soon to take a week off to just sort of let some ideas seep in. Because it does take, it depends on the patch. Some of them come pretty quickly. This patch actually came pretty quickly, but some of them take a lot more time, and sometimes the patch that I start out with is crap, like I talked about at the beginning of the live stream. Take these off my ears. So anyhow, my point is that just I don't think it'll be this Saturday, and it might not be next Saturday, but sometime pretty soon I'm gonna take a week off of the live streams, and like I said, just sort of let some stuff trickle down, because when you're doing it every week, like it's been a great boot camp for me to learn a lot about generative patching, but at the same time, like, it's also easy to fall into ruts or crutches or whatever you want to call them. And I'd like to sort of clear out some space to try some different things. So, yeah. That's what I've got for today, because it's like been 2 hours of me talking an awful lot. I can answer some questions if people have like specific questions about this sort of stuff for a few minutes. But I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. My throat is not awesome. So I'll hang out here for a little bit and answer questions if people got them, and if they don't, then I'll hopefully see you on Saturday. And you know, thanks for stopping in, and you know, if you think of a question later, you can always ask then too in the comments. But yeah. Let me think if there's anything I should be plugging. Oh, I will plug something that has. So the other day when I was putting together this, like I was going through some of the recent stuff, getting the. I published some of the patches earlier in the week, I think Sunday or Monday. And I was going through, before I publish the patches, I try to organize them a little bit. It's not always the best job, as we've seen tonight, but you know, the idea, label some stuff, that sort of thing. Maybe if I have a lot of the way that I patch is like, you know, I'll try to get as much stuff on one page as possible. And that's great for me making a bunch of connections or whatever, but it's not necessarily great for someone coming along trying to interpret those connections. And so, you know, I spend a little bit of time organizing the patches and cleaning them up. And there might be something that I noticed during the live stream that's like minor, but, you know, not worth like interrupting the flow of the live stream to get to. Anyhow, it's a long way of saying I was listening to some of the patches. I was listening to Dreaming itself, which didn't have a name when I premiered it. It's called like unnamed thing, generative thing with sequencers or something like that when I premiered it, but I called it Dreaming itself, which is a bit of a play on words. You know, like either the patch is dreaming itself or it's a meditation on dreaming, whatever. Naming patches is hard. This one's, you know, a little full of itself, but I like the name. Anyhow, I'm a terrible storyteller is what we're learning now. I had my headphones on and I was sitting on the couch watching YouTube videos, and for whatever reason, the Monterey Bay Aquariums jellyfish camera came up. And let me tell you, I remarked about this on the ZOIA Discord. It was like, you know, one of those Alice in Wonderland, or not, Wizard of Oz, Dark Side of the Moon things. They didn't line up perfectly, but there were enough similarities that my brain was just sort of like, wow. So this is a twofold plug. One is the jellyfish cam from the Monterey Bay Aquarium is a terrific thing to pair with all sorts of generative, ambient, dreamy sort of stuff. Those jellyfish, they just, it's like the 21st century lava lamp, you know. And it's probably just as kishy, and I know other people have watched jellyfish cameras. But the other part of that is that one of the things that they're doing with that camera right now is running a fundraiser. So, you know, I'll mention that because I said I was plugging things. You know, if you feel like donating some money to an aquarium, that seems like a pretty good one. If there's one that's local to you, I'm sure lots of aquariums need lots of help. You know, most aquariums, you know, they aren't just like prisons for animals. They're research centers, and they're places that spearhead, you know, a lot of conservation efforts. You know, and the oceans are the front line of climate change. And so, you know, stuff that's happening there is telling us about things that'll happen in the future. And anyhow, so I think there's a lot to applaud about the work of aquariums and other marine conservation efforts around the world. And also maybe you watch some jellyfish and listen to some relaxing music and get even more relaxed. So, you know, that's my plug. I guess I have decided to adopt the Monterey Bay Aquarium as a pet project of mine. So I'll probably end up mentioning it again in some of the Saturday morning live stream chats. I really appreciate that, Aaron, and yeah, jellyfish are weird. It's the biggest proportion between things that I want to look at but don't want to pet. Like, for instance, you know, like I like kind of want to pet, you know, a hippopotamus. I don't really want to look at them. Or like, you know, I'm a cat person, so like I want to look at cats and pet cats. I really want to look at jellyfish, and I have no interest in touching them, which feels different. Okay. So that's all I have got right now. I hope everyone stays safe and digs into something cool to do and patches some, and hopefully this was helpful and maybe a little inspiring. It's weird to say that about something you're doing yourself, but like, you know, I hope at least if someone's on the fence about, you know, generative patching, like, I'm coming at it from someone who has, at this point, accumulated a lot of experience, but I think a lot of it all begins with like just trying some stuff out. You know, try some stuff out. Worst case scenario, you run it through a bunch of reverb and it sounds good. So, you know, and again, I also run things through a lot of reverb and they sound good. So that's I'm not trying to single out Brandon. Should feel seen rather than attacked in this one, because we're all reverbians. But anyhow, so I hope you have a good night and a good week, and maybe I see you on Saturday. And yeah, bye.